On February 29th, 2004, something happened that has not been repeated in 20 years.
It's a clean sweep.
The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, won 11 Oscars in one night, making it a clean sweep for the movie and cementing it as one of the most respected films of all time. This was a monumental achievement, especially given that it was a fantasy adventure film, which many people thought could never receive such critical acclaim. But beyond all the praise and all the awards, there was another factor that was far more alluring to film executives than anything else. Overall, the three films earned just shy of $3 billion. And if there's anything we can learn from Hollywood's history, it's that when a film exceeds a certain amount of profit, you can almost guarantee there's going to be an eventual sequel or spin-off. In today's video, I wanted to talk about the history leading up to what became the Hobbit trilogy, and why it is still to this day such a controversial film among Tolkien fans. My goal is to analyze the good, the bad, and ultimately debate whether or not there is a truly good film buried beneath a lot of tacked on and unnecessary details that caused so many to struggle with the project. As always, feel free to comment down below on what you think of the trilogy, and I'd love to chat with you all about whether or not the Hobbit movies are truly worth salvaging. For everyone familiar with Tolkien's work, we're already well aware that The Lord of the Rings is in fact a sequel to his original work, The Hobbit. So there are many who assumed it would be a no-brainer to adapt that story next. And it hardly felt like a soulless cash grab since there were so many who were desperate to see Bilbo's story brought to the big screen with the same care and attention to detail that Lord of the Rings had just received. And sure enough, 4 years later, in 2007, they announced that Peter Jackson would be returning to Middle-earth as the producer for the Hobbit movie and its sequel. Due to a number of factors, including intense burnout from having worked back-to-back on 3 massive films, Peter Jackson decided he was going to let someone else handle directing these 2 movies. And yes, I said 2, not 3. I'll explain that in a second. The studio ended up bringing in Guillermo del Toro to direct, and while at the time I knew nothing about him, as I've gotten older and experienced more of his filmography, the more I lament the fact that this ultimately never came to be. Guillermo del Toro, Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens all worked together on the script, and their collaboration on the project lasted more than 2 years. Del Toro had many plans for the films and worked tirelessly to recreate the wonders of Middle-earth. A number of Del Toro's influences can even still be found in the final product, including Sylvester McCoy, who was originally his pitch for Radagast. There were also plans to include a number of animatronics in the film, a decision that was ultimately replaced with the overabundance of CGI we're sadly all too familiar with. Things seemed to be going well in production, but due to a number of factors, including repeated delays and financial issues, Guillermo del Toro ended up leaving the project, leaving the movie without a director. While the official story is that Guillermo del Toro ended up leaving due to the delays, I think there is some evidence here that something else was going on behind the scenes. Del Toro was passionate about making this film and laments his departure each time it is brought up. However, filming for this movie began only mere months after Del Toro's departure, which doesn't track with his concerns about the project never being underway. Secondly, pre-production is a monster of a task for a series of this scale. 1 to 2 years of pre-production for a movie this size is easily to be expected. Heck, the original Lord of the Rings trilogy took 3 years to prepare. But at the end of the day, assuming Guillermo del Toro left for any other reason is purely speculation, but it doesn't change the fact that it happened, and the movies continued forward regardless. Now this is where the first major issue with these films began. With Del Toro's departure and the studio desperate for a replacement, Peter Jackson found himself in the unwanted position of being the most qualified one for the job. And what was worse, there was a fear that if he didn't direct it, the production would move away from New Zealand, eliminating all the jobs he had worked so hard to create for many of the locals. And since he had already worked on preparing the film for the last 2 years, it seemed like he was the only hope for this project having any chance of ever being made. But even though Jackson was heralded as the genius who directed The Lord of the Rings, things were going to be a lot different this time. In Jackson's own words, "Because Guillermo del Toro had to leave and I jumped in and took over, we didn't wind the clock back a year and a half and give me a year and a half prep to design the movie, which was different to what he was doing. It was impossible, and as a result of it being impossible, I just started shooting the movie with most of it not prepped at all. You're going on a set and you're winging it. You've got these massively complicated scenes, no storyboards, and you're making it up there and then on the spot. Now these issues make it seem like we have our answer for why the Hobbit movies were uneven. Peter Jackson didn't have enough time to prepare and was forced to lay down the tracks as the train was already in motion. However, I think the truth behind the disappointing final product goes much deeper than that. Within most bad movies, there's almost always one underlying factor that unites them, an influence that causes film to separate from art and become in itself one massive money machine. And that is, of course, the commands from the higher-ups, studio executives who only care about one thing: profitability. When the Lord of the Rings trilogy was made, it was produced by New Line Cinema, who gave Peter Jackson mostly free reign and creative control. Now, the actual story behind how The Lord of the Rings was produced is actually pretty interesting, but it's also a completely different can of worms. For now, what's important to note is that in 2008, New Line Cinema merged with Warner Bros. Pictures, and with that came an entirely new chain of command to oversee the production of The Hobbit. For this next section, I'm going to try to stray away from accusations as much as I can, and frame this all as my own personal speculation. Not much is known about the extent of the studio's involvement of the production of The Hobbit, but from what context we can glean from cast interviews and the overall finished product, it leads one to assume that there was an incredible amount of control given to executives and shareholders over the fate of this movie. The cast and crew are all extremely professional, and even Peter Jackson, who seems to have gotten the brunt of this treatment, never once attempts to blame any studio executive, and even claims that the eventual idea to split the two movies into three was in fact an idea he and the writers came up with and was not mandated by the studio. Personally, I really struggled to believe this, since they had already found a way to split it into two movies and had spent the better part of 2 years preparing to make that project. So to change up that plan as the first movie is in the process of releasing just feels like a very odd and surprising choice. Now, the question is, why was this speculated studio interference such a bad thing? I began this video by referencing the massive commercial success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and that's because I think it's one of the biggest reasons why the Hobbit trilogy was ultimately destined to fail to meet expectations. In the history of Hollywood, there is an endless cycle of studios constantly trying to recapture the success of some of their most successful projects to date. And so when The Hobbit was pitched, the studios only heard one thing: Lord of the Rings, Part 2. In their mind, in order to make The Hobbit as successful as The Lord of the Rings, it needed to become The Lord of the Rings, which, to them, meant making another giant spectacle trilogy of action-packed movies filled with fantasy battles and war. And what was more important, it had to serve as a direct prequel to The Lord of the Rings, and everything that happened in those movies needed to lead nicely into the events of The Lord of the Rings. This is where I believe they truly lost any chance of making The Hobbit good, because The Hobbit was never meant to have much of a thematic crossover with Rings. It is a very different book, a children's story with much smaller stakes and a far more whimsical and magical outlook on the world. Bilbo's discovery of the ring is really one of the only major tie-ins, and even that had to be later retconned to fit into the story of the Lord of the Rings once Tolkien decided how he wanted the story to go. From what we know of Guillermo del Toro's pitch, it sounds like he was fully intending on leaning into those aspects of The Hobbit, and he wanted to create a movie that felt different and unique when compared to Lord of the Rings. And it is for that reason that I speculate he left the project. My big conspiracy theory around this is that the studio did not want him to be experimental, and instead wanted to copy and paste everything that worked in The Lord of the Rings into The Hobbit, and then crank it up to 1,000. My assumption is that Del Toro left due to the lack of creativity he was allowed to employ, and decided to jump ship before things could get worse. Looking back at the Hobbit trilogy, it is painfully obvious how often they try to remind you at how great The Lord of the Rings is at each and every turn. And as the series goes on, it gets less and less creative and subtle. But right off the bat, you have the redesign of the main dwarven characters. Well, for the most part, I think they did a great job of creating 13 unique and memorable dwarves. It's clear that the studio was afraid to commit to the bit. And by that I mean, pay attention to which dwarves get the most amount of screen time as the trilogy goes on. Those A-list dwarves have been retrofitted into more attractive, Aragorn-esque appearances in an effort to capture the formula of Lord of the Rings. Not to mention the heavy inclusion of characters like Legolas, who serve no purpose to the plot, and yet manage to steal more screen time than probably 8 of the 13 dwarves put together. Now, that might be over-exaggerating, but he definitely gets more lines. Hell, Bombur, the fat dwarf, gets 1 line in the entire trilogy, and it's in the extended edition, which was rated R, because why? This is a children's story. Sorry, I'm getting carried away. Other good examples of ringifying the story include the major inclusion of Gandalf's side quest, which serves as the major narrative tie-in to the war against Sauron. And they also go out of their way to establish that the Battle of the Five Armies is actually this really important battle that might just determine the fate of the world, when in the books, its sole purpose is to give commentary on how pointless war is. If more of us valued home above gold, this world would be a merrier place. That line is supposed to cement that idea, but whatever, add your hour-long battle, because hey, people thought Helm's Deep was cool, then they thought Minas Tirith was awesome. What if we made an even bigger battle? Just to round out a couple of the changes I'm sure are studio mandates, there's the entire elf-dwarf love triangle, which is a complete mockery of Tolkien's themes and warrants its own video, but I'm going to move past it. Even though you can find a cast interview where Evangeline Lilly talks about how she only joined the project on the promise that she wouldn't be in a love triangle, and then the studio was like, hey, what if you were in a love triangle? I don't want to talk about Tauriel, and while it might come as a shock to you, in my opinion, one of the most egregious add-ons is this following scene in its entirety. Now, despite everything that irks me about this, the thing that really makes my blood boil is the music choice. I know many people don't notice and don't really care about some of these things, but I grew up almost solely listening to Howard Shore's soundtrack music. And the theme you just heard is the Nazgul theme, which, aside from being completely inappropriate thematically, it has lyrics. We deny our maker, we cling to the darkness, we grasp for ourselves power and glory. Now we come, the Nine, Lords of Eternal Life. How does that have anything to do with the scene at hand? And I know that Howard Shore would never have been so lazy as to reuse a completely unrelated theme for that scene. He writes unique themes for almost every single character, including the aforementioned Tauriel. So to me, what this scene says is that the passion that existed in the creation of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the attention to detail, time and effort, and genuine joy that everyone exuded whilst working on it does not exist to the same degree within the Hobbit trilogy. This music choice is all I need to confirm my suspicions that a studio executive took one look at this scene and said, hey, let's throw in that cool song from Lord of the Rings that everyone likes. It just sounds so epic, and it will remind people this movie's set in the same universe. And the fact that Peter Jackson couldn't veto things like that, it really makes you wonder how much of this movie was really up to him. Now, throughout this video, I've spent a lot of time going into the history of the production surrounding The Hobbit, and if you've gotten this far, you probably assume that I hate the films, but here's your twist. I actually really like them, and here's the part where I'm gonna make my case for why I think buried under all the studio mandates, there is a genuinely well-made and fulfilling adaptation of The Hobbit right beneath our feet. I wanted to use this section to shout out a creator known as StromboliBones, who compiled his own fan edit of the Hobbit trilogy where he removed and tweaked all the aspects he felt bogged it down.
I edited the Hobbit films into a 5-hour miniseries. It is currently the highest rated and most reviewed Hobbit edit on fanedit.org. My main goal with this project was to remove the things that really drug these films down, thus allowing the parts that were actually good to come to the forefront. I then took this a step further and included what I consider to be the best parts of some other Hobbit edits.
I watched the project and found it incredible, and it was initially what inspired me to make a video like this. It wasn't until watching his edit that I really began to come to terms with the fact that there are so many parts of this trilogy that I genuinely adore. One of the things I think is so impressive about StromboliBones' edits is that it doesn't really add anything too over the top to the films. And if you've watched them before, that tracks, since the main issue is the amount of bonus content and unnecessary time spent with random characters or locations. But it wasn't until I watched his edit that I really recognized how much these segments really detract from the movie, because without them in, absolutely nothing is lost, and there is a genuinely good film to be experienced. I was also constantly surprised by the way scenes were able to seamlessly transition into each other without the inclusion of the unnecessary fat. I was positive that Stromboli's edit would be full of awkward jump cuts or background elements that wouldn't fit contextually. But no, it all still works as a cohesive story, and proves that Peter Jackson wrote a faithful screenplay of The Hobbit, filmed it all, and then filmed an extra 2 hours of fluff so it could be padded out into 3 movies. StromboliBones' edit is 5 parts, and honestly, I think it really works that way. It almost kind of feels like a limited series you might watch on TV. And if I'm being candid, I almost think The Hobbit would have worked better as a TV show, since the book really is split so nicely into these bite-sized adventures each chapter. It would have just worked really well as episodes. There are, unfortunately, still some issues that exist and are almost exacerbated by the edit. Though, to no fault of Stromboli, it merely emphasizes the weaknesses of the films themselves. And what I'm mainly referring to is the fact that so many of the dwarves are sidelined as the series moves on, as I mentioned earlier. But when you cut out all the characters that existed solely for the purpose of stealing screen time and lines from the dwarves, you really start to feel this loss of the characterization between the main group. For all that these movies tried to build off the vibe of The Lord of the Rings, they really failed to capture the essence of the Fellowship. And in case you didn't realize it, the Fellowship is split up for the majority of the trilogy. And I think they really only have like 2 hours where they're all together, and that's including the extended edition. And it's also only counting it if you continue to count their time after Gandalf dies, because if not, they have like an hour and a half tops. Yet, when they reunite at the end of the trilogy and say their farewells, you feel this immense, bittersweet feeling for them to be parted. The Fellowship feels like a family, and it hurts to see them go their separate ways. And again, to bring up the time difference, Bilbo is together with the dwarves from almost the very beginning of the first movie, all the way to the last 10 minutes of the final movie. And yet, despite having almost triple the amount of time that the Fellowship did, I felt almost nothing as Bilbo said his goodbyes. In fact, the scene in question feels like it was shot during reshoots because they forgot to include it the first time around. Now, I know that I just totally got sidetracked on a tangent here, but I hope you understand the point I'm trying to make. To make a long story short, I really believe that StromboliBones' edit brings out the best that this series has to offer. If you're like me and you're a huge Tolkien fan and you struggle to really enjoy The Hobbit, then I can't recommend checking out his edit enough. There will be a link in the description if you're interested in checking it out. I don't know if we'll ever see The Hobbit remade, and frankly, I don't really want that. There is so much that I think they got right in these movies that to see it all scrapped would really be a shame. I think it will forever continue to just be one of the biggest what-ifs, where we'll sadly never get to know how this movie would have been if things had just run smoothly from the start. But once more, just to reiterate, I did enjoy these movies. I don't consider them to be horrid abominations like some people do, and have learned to separate the good from the bad. And if I'm being honest, there really is a lot of good to be found within these films. To list off a big positive, the casting for these movies is done exceptionally well, and even the characters I didn't really enjoy still gave fantastic performances. None more so than the Hobbit himself. Martin Freeman perfectly embodies the role of Bilbo Baggins, and I really struggle to imagine anyone else capturing his essence so perfectly. In fact, one of the biggest issues of this whole trilogy is the fact that they end up pushing who was meant to be the main character into a glorified cameo by the end of it. Secondly, aside from the overabundance of CGI, the visuals in this movie are genuinely stunning. And the design that goes into each location is done with so much care and attention to detail that I truly can't envision it any other way. Regardless of how I felt about the overall narrative, so many aspects of the Hobbit trilogy will forever continue to be the way I envision them when I reread the books. I have so many fond memories of watching these movies come out when I was younger, and frankly, Just the experience of being excited about a new Middle-earth project and seeing everyone else share in that is just such a great feeling. If you've made it to the end of the video, be sure to comment down below what your experience with the Hobbit movies was. Or let me know what topics you'd like me to cover in a future video. I love getting to talk about the things I'm passionate about, and this video has been a lot of fun to research and to make. Another huge shout out and thanks to StromboliBones for all your help and feedback on this video. And, of course, for making the edit itself. Be sure to check it out if you haven't already. But just to summarize here, I would wholeheartedly say that the Hobbit trilogy is definitely worth salvaging, and will hopefully be looked back on in the future for what they did right, and not what they did wrong.